So I'm just going to put up the presentation, just do a screen share, and hopefully you'll be able to follow through where we go. Growing Young is a programme that we've been offering. We have had 24 congregations, really the length and breadth of Scotland, from Dumfriesshire all the way up to Inverness, who shared in a cohort which finished just at the tail end of the summer. Growing Young was something which was birthed in Fuller Youth Institute, and really has come about because the majority of churches are growing old, and not just in the UK, but also in the States as well. That's becoming part of the pattern, that the majority of churches are growing old. And the thing is, how do you buck that trend, and what are the difference in the churches that are engaging younger people? And what this cohort offers is an opportunity to join a network of churches who are deliberately focusing on how to grow young. So recognise the difficulty that's there and are saying, actually, there are things that we can begin to do about this. We need to seek God in this. We need to plan carefully together, and we need to look at what we can do. And the sense that we have in all of this is that it is about becoming multi-generational, that actually the desire that most folk have is to be part of a church that is multi-generational. So it's not just about creating youth churches, it's about multi-generational churches. And what we've said right at the very beginning is that this is about a long-term journey and not a quick fix. We recognise that it's taken us a long time to get to where we are, and actually beginning to turn the corner in that and move the other direction will take considerable time. But we believe it is an important journey for us to take, and beginning that journey we think is important. The strapline that Fuller have given to this is helping young people discover and love our church. Actually, we'd want to rebrand that as helping to build a multi-generational church. We believe that that's what this is about. It's not about making church unattractive to other generations, but actually discovering that as we change what we do to attract younger generations, actually it has an impact on all generations and in positive ways. Erwin McManus, who's one of the youth advisors in Fuller, has said this: healthy churches reach young people, and young people make churches healthier. If your church is reaching 20-year-olds, your church will reach 60-year-olds. And that certainly has been part of the pattern of what they've discovered, that this is not just about something for young people, but is actually something about the shape of our churches for all generations. So what will we provide? We'll provide teaching around what's important, and that would be key in what we do. And we'll provide the space to work through what you can do. And this time we're deliberately focusing on congregations that have got few or no young people. And the sense often that folk have is we can't do anything. And we look at other places and we see what they're doing and we say, we can't do that. This cohort provides an opportunity to think about what you can do and not to feel stuck. And alongside that, what we will provide is the support to see it through. So it's that sense of thinking about what we can do, and actually folk sitting alongside us and encouraging us to see through what we say we will take on. So that really, in many ways, is the key of what we're talking about initially. It's actually saying we can feel stuck where we are, and it's about saying, how can we get unstuck? What are the things that we can begin to do? And finding that there are folk that sit alongside us and encourage us to kind of begin to do that. And I think all of us have got the experience of going to conferences where we came back enthused and excited, and it lasted for a short time. The whole thing behind this is saying, we think this will take 2 years of working it through with folk, and it's about a consistent approach of kind of seeing things through. So that really is the background to what we will provide. Let me go back just to the presentation. What Fuller did was went and looked at the churches that were growing young. So the churches that were doing well in reaching younger generations. And what they discovered was 6 key characteristics, which they put together in what's called the growing young wheel. And you'll see that there are 6 kind of green, different colours of green kind of round, and those were the 6 key characteristics that they found. What they said was, though, that each of those churches was a Jesus-centred community. So they're not just community organisations, they're churches who are centred on Jesus. And the other thing, the outer rim is saying, and every one of those churches was shaped by its context. So what will be possible in Eyemouth will be different from Tyne Valley, will be different from Coldingham, will be different from Eyemouth, from Traprain. They're all very different. And therefore, what is shaped in those places will look different. But there were 6 things that they saw that were important in each of those churches they looked at. One of the things was key chain leadership. They said keys are a sign of authority. And in those churches, what we saw was that they were trusting young people in leadership. And the question is, how do we begin to do that? How do we begin to involve young folk in leadership and begin to see key chain leadership? I really realised this one when my daughter went to do a year out in another church. And I went to visit her. And she said at 6:30, looking at her watch, "Dad, I've got to go. I'm opening up at the youth club tonight." And there she was at 18 in charge of the youth club that night. Now, I realised in Lonehead, we would never have given her that kind of authority. We would never have given her the keys in that kind of way. But actually, she was ready to take that kind of responsibility. So what does that look like in our churches? What does that mean? Sometimes it's very simple things. Giving young folk a responsibility in leadership, and actually realising that folk in their 20s and 30s are already taking major leadership responsibilities everywhere else. So that sense of how do we involve young people in terms of leadership? The second one was empathy today, which is about understanding. They discovered that young folk in those churches said, folk take the time to listen to us and understand us. That's why the sign that's there is a coffee cup. So people take that time with us. Often young folk find themselves judged. Yeah, they're not doing what we did. They're not looking at things the way that we looked at things. But actually in those churches, they were understood and folk took time with them. The third thing was that Jesus' message was taken seriously. So the young folk in those churches were saying, in these contexts, folk are living out their faith. It's not just about what they do on a Sunday. It's about faith being lived out 24/7, and that being important. The fourth thing was warm relationships. So it wasn't just that they were understood, but that folk were taking time across the church to look out for each other. The fifth thing, and the most contentious thing, was that what they discovered in those churches was that young people were being prioritised everywhere. So not just good youth work, but actually across the piece, as the church thought about what they did, they thought about how it impacted young folk and made sure that young folk were prioritised. And what Fuller have said is that actually, if you do the other 5 and don't do this one, you will still grow old. It's the one that is key. So how do we prioritise young people everywhere? That's the one at Lonehead. Certainly we took part in the last cohort, and we'd be saying this was actually key for us, thinking, how does everything that we do impact young people? When we're actually wired within the Church of Scotland, generally to think about, how does this impact older people? Whenever we're making decisions, that tends to be the thing we think about. How's this going to impact older people? And it's about changing that wiring and beginning to say, actually, if we don't prioritise young people, they won't be around. And so how do we do that? And I've actually begun to think, how does that, what they discovered was that this benefits everybody. And that actually, as you prioritise young people, the church changes shape in a way that benefits everybody. So I thought, how does that work? And one very simple example for us would be, thinking about streaming our services. And the folk who wanted to stream our services were young folk, weren't old folk. So we've done that. We now stream our services. Who benefits from that? I've got a number of folk in their 80s who can't get out on Sundays, but their family have managed to put YouTube on their televisions and they managed to watch our services on Sunday mornings. So we prioritise young people by streaming the services, but lo and behold, it benefited absolutely everybody. Now that's one very simple example, and you might say, well, you're picking that, there's hundreds of others where that's not true. But actually what we've discovered is that as we prioritise young people, actually it does benefit everybody. And once we can get over that hurdle of folks seeing that, it actually is something that we begin to do. So how do we prioritise young people? Another church, just a very simple example, Barclay Church in Edinburgh, and they've got a group of young folk who are older primary, who are beginning to disengage with church. And they decided, actually going to change our order of service. And we're going to do a prayer and we're going to do the reading before the young folk go next door. And we're going to get the young folk to do that prayer and reading. So we want to prioritise these young people. And what they discovered was that these older primary youngsters suddenly began to engage with church again. Instead of saying to their parents, oh, do we have to go on Sunday? They were looking forward to being there because either they or one of their friends was doing the reading or doing the prayer. What the older folk in the congregation saying? It's wonderful to see the young folk doing something that I couldn't have done at their age. It's just another very simple example of how prioritising young people actually benefits everybody. So that becomes a keystone in many ways of how do we begin to do that. And then the final one in the Growing Young wheel would be about being best neighbours. So again, what they discovered in those churches was that the churches weren't turned in on themselves. The churches were actually caring about what happened in the world around them and in the wider world. And young folk wanted to be part of churches where that was true. So Growing Young is about saying these 6 things were seen in the churches that were growing young. And actually, I see those same 6 things in the churches in Scotland that are growing young. So it's not an American model, it's actually true across different cultures. And Growing Young would be about saying, how do we make sure all these 6 things are seen in our churches? And how do we work towards them? So that really is the essence of what we're doing. And what we've been saying to folk is you'll be doing some of these things, if not all of them already in some ways. But it's actually about how we deliberately go deeper with each of these, how we really focus on them and root them more deeply. So the ongoing focus really in Growing Young is developing a plan for what you can do or change, and what it will be for you will be different from other people. One of the things I heard from a church who'd taken part in this, we actually went out to California to see some of the churches. And one of the ministers there said, there was no point at which I would say we turned the corner. Actually, as I look back, it was just incremental changes. We did a bit at a time. He said it was like the cogs on a wheel. The cogs just turned a bit at a time. And we built on what we did and went on. And that is a very helpful image. So it's about doing a bit at a time and taking it at a pace that we and our churches can manage. The early work will be a focus on listening. It's actually saying, actually, we need to listen to younger people if we're going to shape church for them. We shouldn't presume to know what they want. And we often have done that. But actually, we need to listen to what younger people are saying. And in our context, younger people might be those in their 30s or 40s, rather than teenagers or those at primary school. If our congregation are all over 60, what are 40s and 50s saying to us? How do we listen to them? And how do we take account of that in our planning? The next stage is to experiment, not all of which go the right way, some of which might blow up in our face, but it's about trying some new things or changing some existing things that we're doing. And it's about that pattern of let's try something and let's see where it takes us. Now, it's not rocket science. When I did this presentation first time, the church said, can you give us some examples of the the things that folk did. So here are some of the examples of things that folk did. One church did a beach clean because the young folk said, let's do something that we can involve the community in. All of this was done during COVID. So let's get outside and do something. Let's do church and community doing a beach clean. Again, during COVID, somebody said, let's do a quiz night. The young people said, actually, let's do a quiz night and we'll organise it. So everybody went and watched a film and then did a quiz night, mixed generations in each of the groups. Young folk organised it, folk really enjoyed it. In my own congregation, we recognised that many of our families, Sunday morning is actually very difficult for them. So we started doing praise and pasta events, Saturday, 4 o'clock. Come along, we're going to do some praise together, we're going to do a family type event, and then we're going to just eat together. Another church paired up every young person with a mentor. They said, actually for us, this is about empathy. How do we understand our young people? Another church said, we can't actually do any work with young people just now. We don't have the people to do it. We don't have the expertise. But what we can do is a mums and tots event and begin to do work with them and make sure that there's something about the gospel in what we do. And that's where they started. One church was saying, actually, we need to get young folk involved in leadership. So one way of doing that is just getting them working PowerPoint at services on a Sunday. Actually, if you do that, you discover that the young folk often do that better than older folk because they give their full mind and attention to it. Another church did a holiday club and said, we've only got the capacity to do this for 20, but we're going to start there. And they did a holiday club for 20 young people. So all of that was stuff that was achievable. It wasn't big stuff, it was small stuff. You might be looking at that going, you know, that doesn't mean very much. But it was for them the first cog, the first turn. If you're saying we could start at something beyond that, then that's great. If you're beyond the first or the second cog, it's simply about building on those things. But it is about a bit at a time and keeping it going. So essentially it's about experimenting, reflecting, experimenting, reshaping and building up. And at the same time, thinking about the mindset of the congregation. So one of the things we encourage folk to do through all of this is to preach through those 6 things that we spoke about. So we've preached through twice at Lone Head, those 6 things, key chain leadership, empathy today, took a week over each of them. We preached round that twice so that everybody in the church begins to understand that it's about everybody in the church being involved in this. It's not about a few children's and youth workers doing stuff. It's about the whole way the church functions and about the way that we are as God's people. So the church that did the holiday club for 20 people, this is Jamie Livingston, who was one of the members there. He said the holiday club was described as the catalyst that got the church moving again. Now we've got a lot more young people on the periphery of the church than we once did, and a lot more connections with families in the town. So they built on that, and they've got more young folk around and more families, and are beginning to take that forward. So what we will provide through Growing Young is that sense of, you know, there's going to be something that's going to try and keep the momentum going. So we will provide 2 or 3 full-day conferences. We're actually looking at doing those on Saturdays, and we're looking at probably doing them from 9 o'clock through till 2 o'clock, something like that. So you've still got the rest of your Saturday. We'll do regular webinars, which is the equivalent of what we're doing just now. There'll be a coach mentor appointed for each minister and congregation. So somebody to keep in touch with, somebody who'll be asking how you're getting on, somebody you can turn to for advice. If you want to know a bit more about that, then Douglas was a coach mentor last time round, so he'll be able to tell you a bit about that. And then there's networking opportunities. One of the things is actually hearing what other churches are doing and thinking, well, we could do that, and we couldn't do what they're talking about. What we could do, what that other lot are talking about. And it's those networking opportunities that allow us to glean ideas from other people and take them forward. This is how the first 6 months would kind of look like. So an introductory webinar in January, which will actually be bringing in some of the folk who have already done Growing Young in Scotland and gleaning a wee bit about learning a wee bit about what they've been doing. So the first webinar would be in February. March, we'll do our first day conference. End of April, our second, and then a webinar in May, a coaching hour in June, July and August off, and then the same kind of pattern in September through to January. And then the second year would start again, but opportunities all the time to be engaging with you and for you to be engaging with other people. What's required from you? If a congregation are going to be involved, we'd be looking for a commitment from the minister and Kirk session. We actually, because we know this is about the whole of church, it's not just about a few folk, it does need a commitment from the minister and the Kirk session. And there is a price tag with this. It will cost you £250 a year. For that, you're getting your coaching, you're getting your input. We will be using some of input from folk at Fuller. We're getting support from them in taking this forward. You'll be getting some booklets to work through. You will also get access to video materials online from Fuller. So a fair bit of stuff that's there. We've also learned that when you give people it free, folk don't value it as much. So there is something about saying, we want you to think through whether you really want to do this. And if you do, then £250 a year, we think is actually quite a small price tag for what's there. Those in the first cohort paid £2,000 for the first year and £1,000 for the second. We'd be looking for a small team from your congregation, so 4 or 5 people initially. And if possible, we'd suggest that that team would include the minister, somebody in their 20s or 30s, a parent, so somebody who's got perhaps a teenager or somebody at primary school, and someone else from the Kirk session. We wouldn't want the team any bigger than that, because that team will begin to think about how they might grow and what others might need included. So probably starting with 4 or 5 or even 3 initially would work, but that kind of size for a growing young team. And that team will be the team who will come to the conferences, come to the webinars, keep the Kirk session in touch with what's going on, begin to think about what experiments might be done, and draw others into what's going on. So let me just finish with a quote from one of the congregations who took part, and then a chance for you to ask some questions. The congregation who did some work with mums and tots because they didn't have the capacity to do anything else were Cohort Church in Glasgow. And Gillian Crompton, when we interviewed her, said this: "It's been a fruitful journey for us. We've grown through the learning that's come from growing young and the hope it gave us. We didn't quite know how to turn things around. Growing young offered us the approach we needed." So for them, it was undoubtedly the right thing and done at the right time. I think the thing for you to be working through yourselves is, is this for us, and is this for just now?